Two archaeologists, Lancaster Harding and Roland DeVoe, began excavating Qumran in 1953, and they worked at the site for 4 years. Their discoveries, along with the Manual of Discipline, one of the scrolls from Cave 1, have answered most of the questions. They learned that Qumran was a Jewish monastic community, probably Essenes. They settled here in the Judean desert about 130 B.C., and except for 30 years during Herod the Great's reign, they lived here for 200 years till they were destroyed by the Romans. The Essenes believed that the Jewish nation had fallen away from God. They were the faithful remnant, the sons of light, and they had fled to the wilderness to wait for the end of days and the coming of the kingdom. They were looking for two messiahs, a priest and a ruler like David. These ruins where they lived for nearly 200 years tell us a lot about this Essene community. This was the only section of the community building that was 2 stories high. It was a tall tower, probably intended for the protection of the community at time of attack. The archaeologists found the scriptorium, or library, where the Essenes worked on the scrolls. Ink pots were even found here, along with stone tables and benches. They also found a piece of pottery with the Hebrew alphabet crudely lettered on it, maybe the work of some young scribe just beginning his training.
We know from the Manual of Discipline, one of the manuscripts found in Cave 1, that the Essenes worked in shifts 24 hours a day in this library, scriptorium, writing commentaries, copying their precious manuscripts of the Bible.
The largest room in the building, 75 feet long, has been called the Hall of the Congregation.
And we know from the Manual of Discipline that the men of the congregation met here for all of their meals together. And every meal was a sort of sacred meal or a community meal. As the men of the congregation ate together, one of them would be reading from the Scripture and expounding the Scripture, so there was a sacred import to each one of their meals.
Qumran also had an elaborate water system with large cisterns and a water channel flowing through the buildings. Here's a floor plan of the buildings. The scriptorium is number 2, and the water system is shown in blue. The Essenes had to have a water supply because it was so hot in the desert. Also, the Essenes practiced ceremonial immersion, baptism, and they had to have running water in their mikvoth or baptistries. What about food? There are freshwater springs down near the Dead Sea, and the Essenes probably raised enough grain down there to feed the community. And these springs probably explain why the Essenes settled here in the first place. Living here in solitude, the Essenes were waiting for God's kingdom to come. But their solitude was shattered in 68 AD when the Jews rebelled against Rome. The Roman army marched down the Jordan Valley and destroyed Jericho, then Qumran. As the army approached, the Essenes must have hidden their manuscripts in the caves. The men may all have perished, but their scrolls survived to be discovered by accident in 1947. The 7 scrolls from Cave 1 are on display in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, built in honor of Samuel Goetzmann, who bought the scrolls from the Syrian bishop and returned them to Israel. The outside of the museum looks like the lid of one of the pottery jars from Cave 1, and inside, 2 of the jars the shepherd found are on display. One of them is about 3 feet tall. The second is a little shorter. The inside of the museum is like a cave, and it's rather dark. This gives the illusion of being in a cave, and it also protects the scrolls from light. The Isaiah scroll is the museum's treasure, and it's displayed in a circular case in the center of the room. This scroll is 2,000 years old, and this makes it the oldest manuscript of a complete book of the Bible that has ever been discovered. It has every chapter and every verse that we have in our Bibles, and except for a few very minor variations, the Hebrew text is identical with the Masoretic text that was used for all of our English translations of the Bible. Some scholars believe that there are 2 Isaiahs, with a break in the book between chapters 39 and 40. But the Isaiah scroll has no such break, only a little mark to show the end of chapter 39 and the beginning of chapter 40. Another scroll found in Cave 1 is this commentary on Habakkuk. In their commentary, the Essenes applied everything in the book of Habakkuk to their own times. Another scroll is the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. It describes the warfare between good and evil, and some of the language, like Sons of Light, sounds very much like the Gospel of John. Except for Isaiah, the Manual of Discipline is the most valuable scroll because it has all the rules and regulations that govern the Qumran community. And it's also been very important for a study of the book of Acts. It tells how people joined the community, how they held everything in common, and it gives the rules of conduct they lived under. The Temple Scroll is the longest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, even longer than Isaiah, and it remained hidden until 1967. The shrine of the book also has some letters from the Second Jewish Revolt in 132 A.D., and they are displayed in this tunnel-like room. These letters were found in 1961 in a cave several miles south of Qumran. They were written on papyrus by Simon Bar Kokhba, who led the Second Revolt. Bar Kokhba wrote this letters to his commanders at Ein Gedi. In this letter, Bar Kokhba mentions one of his generals, Yeshua, the first word on the second line. Yeshua is the exact name in Hebrew of Jesus, and this shows how the name Jesus was written in the first century. In this letter, Bar Kokhba orders one of his generals to put the Galileans in fetters. The Galileans were the Jewish Christians, and this is the first tangible evidence outside the New Testament of the persecution of believers. Now, let's talk about the value of these scrolls found at Qumran. Why have they been called the most important manuscript discovery of the 20th century? Before the scrolls were discovered, the oldest Hebrew manuscript of the Old Testament was the Aleppo Codex, which they also have at the shrine of the book. It was copied about 900 A.D. So this means that the Isaiah scroll is 1,000 years older than the oldest Hebrew manuscript before its discovery. And this means that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars now have invaluable new sources for studying the text of the Old Testament. The scrolls are also valuable because of the information they have about community life at Qumran.
The communities of Qumran and the New Testament community had many similarities. For example, when one reads the book of Acts and finds that the believers put all things in common. The model for such a community obviously was Qumran, that had already been living this way for over 100 years in the vicinity of Jerusalem.
Remember that the Essenes had a water system at Qumran that provided running water for their mikvoth, or baptistries.
The Qumran community was very, very conscious of the Old Testament purity laws. And for this reason, they practiced ritual immersion, which we call baptism, many times a day. They practiced it every time they got ceremonially unclean.
As important as the Dead Sea Scrolls are, let's remember that there are hundreds of other ancient manuscripts of the Bible in the museums of the world. One of the greatest of these is the Sinaitic manuscript in the British Museum. It was discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery by Count Tischendorf in the 1840s. This manuscript has all 27 books of the New Testament, and it was copied in the 4th century. The oldest New Testament manuscript is the John Rylands Papyrus. It's only a small part of John chapter 18, but this manuscript was made in the first half of the 2nd century, perhaps within 50 years of the original writing of John. The Samaritans who live at the base of Mount Gerizim have an ancient manuscript of the Pentateuch. One of their priests, Saloon, shows it to us.
25 meters long, about 100 feet. This only the 5 books of Moses: Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This book written on sheepskin, the skin of the sheep of the sacrifice. And who is wrote it? The 4th generation from Aaron.
Scholars believe that this manuscript is about 1,500 years old, and it's another valuable witness to the text of the Old Testament. In 1980, archaeologists found a burial cave in Jerusalem 2,700 years old and never disturbed. This silver amulet was in the cave, and when it was unrolled, it proved to be the priestly blessing in number 6 engraved on the silver. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. This is now the oldest fragment of Scripture ever discovered, about 500 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls and these many other manuscripts, we can have great confidence in the text of our Bible. When we read the Bible, we don't need to ask, is this book just like it was written by Matthew and John and Paul? We don't need to ask that question. We can be sure that it is.